It is both easy and unfortunate to forget about the traditional church during these heady days of Christian renewal and reform, which is often characterized as being dominated by Protestant theology and the programs of Luther, Calvin, Cranmer, the Anabaptists, and many others. The assumption that the Catholics were simply out of the running in terms of Christian vitality and witness is as much misguided as it is uninformed. Church renewal was not the exclusive possession of the Protestants. Indeed, there were popes and bishops, local priests, monks and nuns actively concerned with the state of the church, and who were also utterly committed to fulfilling the Great Commission of Christ to preach the gospel, make disciples, and engage with the active promise of Christ's presence on earth. Geiler of Kaisersberg, Savonarola, Reginald Pole, Ignatius Loyola are but some of these reform-minded members of the Catholic Church who implemented programs aimed at infusing new life into the faith. Their stories are fundamental to understanding Catholic Europe in the 16th century.
At the end of the Middle Ages, the Christian Church, as we've been examining, was experiencing profound reformation, profound change. Now, 16th century Reformation was not, as many people assume, the sole provenance of Protestants. And too often it's been presented that way. When you speak of Reformation, you're talking about Protestants. The favored term in describing the Catholics of this period in Protestant historiography has been counter-Reformation. There was a counter-Reformation, all right, but also there was a Catholic Reformation, a Catholic reform movement, indeed a series of movements, and I want to turn our attention to that in this particular session. It might be said with some accuracy that given the advances made within the Church in the 16th century, that it's not far off the mark to refer to Catholic formation rather than Catholic reformation or Reformation. There were certainly differences in theology, in liturgy, and in religious practice which distinguished Roman Catholicism from Protestantism in very important ways, in matters such as justification, grace, predestination, the Mass, indulgences, and the veneration of saints, as some examples. The sacrament of penance was possibly the sacrament most stressed by the later medieval church, and the one which lay people probably understood the best, at least the one they knew the most about. Of course, the Mass was pretty central, as we have examined previously. In fact, it was regarded as so central that there were Protestant reformers who said they were abolishing Roman Catholicism because they had abolished the Mass. Well, it's important to note that there is a difference between church renovatio, which means renewal, and church reformatio, reformation. The former, renewal, was aimed at infusing new life into the faith, and many of the reforming streams within Catholicism had that as its aim, to renew, to infuse new life. The latter, Reformation, was an attempt to return the Church to her ancient forms of teaching and practice. I submit that Catholics were not attempting to return the Church to its ancient forms. The Protestants were trying with varying degrees of success to do just that. Writing in the year 1593, Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, in his Apology, the disputations concerning controversies, defined the Church as the community of people brought together by the profession of the same Christian faith, joined in the communion of the same sacraments under the government of legitimate pastors, especially the one Vicar of Christ on earth, the Roman pontiff. Well, Protestants could agree with all of that, except maybe for that last bit, but with their own particular interpretations. But before anyone had heard the name Martin Luther, movements for reform within Christendom were in motion. The Fifth Lateran Council convened in Rome in 1512 and sat for 5 years. In March of 1517, a man by the name of Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola, wow, that's a mouthful, addressed Pope Leo X and the Lateran Fathers, and we'll just call him Mirandola. And Mirandola said, these diseases and these wounds must be healed by you, Holy Father. Otherwise, if you fail to heal these wounds, I fear that God himself, whose place on earth you take, will not apply a gentle cure, but with fire and sword will cut off those diseased members and destroy them, and I believe he has already clearly given signs of his future remedy. The references to death, spiritual death, already creeping through the corridors of Christendom. Now I draw your attention to the date, March 1517. Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola says, March 1517, we've got to do something, otherwise something catastrophic is going to happen. March 1517. You know what happens exactly 6 months later. Somebody that nobody had ever heard of before, Martin Luther, walked down the street in a little old German town called Wittenberg and nailed a document to the doors of the church. 6 months later, it's almost like Mirandola was prophesying. Do something or something massive is going to happen. He was not a voice in the wilderness. The Italian bishop Zaccaria Ferrari addressed Pope Hadrian VI in 1523 with this word, cleanse Rome, and the world will be cleansed. In early 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici wrote a letter to his 16-year-old son Giovanni, who was going to Rome to take up residence as a cardinal. And his father Lorenzo writes, I well know that as you are now to reside in Rome, that sink of all iniquity, the difficulty of conducting yourself by these admonitions will be increased. You will probably, son, meet with those who will particularly endeavor to corrupt you and incite you with vice. Giovanni de' Medici, this 16-year-old boy, became Pope Leo X, the man with whom Luther would do battle over Reformation. Well, the state of the official church finds classic expression in the book, the narrative called The Ship of Fools, written by Sebastian Brandt and published at Basel in 1494. One verse I read to you from The Ship of Fools. St. Peter's ship is swaying madly. It may be wrecked or damaged badly. The waves are striking against the side, and storm and trouble may betide. Now, as previously mentioned, there had been attempts, mostly on paper, at ecclesiastical renewal. But all these were more or less dead letters. Nothing was accomplished, nothing gained, all talk, no action, much ado about nothing. In fact, the papacy in the later 15th century, the papacy of princes, as it's been called, entered a period of unprecedented moral disintegration which culminated in the most scandalous venality and secularization of the church and the papacy you could possibly imagine. Three, not one, three successive popes who reigned from 1471 to 1453 were really rascals, just scoundrels. Pope Sixtus IV was reputed to have had sexual affairs with two of his young nephews, and was in any event a homosexual profligate. The second of these popes, Innocent VIII, ran an informal brothel using papal revenue to support the activities, while the third, Alexander VI, sponsored wild sexual orgies in the papal palace on a regular basis. Now, all of this was fairly common knowledge, at least in Rome, and many felt that it could not go unpunished. Pico della Mirandola. These wounds, these diseases have got to be healed, or God is going to do something. This 12th century carving in the portal, in the doorway of the Abbey Church of Saint-Pierre in France, at eye level, I might add, depicts the allegory of lust punished. Opposite her master, the devil, lust personified as this young woman. She writhes in agonies as toads and snakes devour the appropriate parts of her body, eye level, in the doorway of the church. Well, in the midst of a sea of impiety, while the ship of fools, the church, appeared to founder upon the stormy seas, I have to tell you that reform within the church intensified. There were centers of mystical spirituality, stressing meditation and the inner life of prayer and contemplation, frequent communion, austerity, and self-renunciation, completely the opposite of these rascal popes that I just mentioned to you. There were houses for men and women. There was an emphasis upon education and upon learning. Indeed, Erasmus himself was taught by the brethren of the common life, and there were quite a number of reformed-minded mystics in the period between the 14th and the 16th centuries, like Teresa of Avila as one example. Now, the Catholic Reformation, as I'm calling it, was a parallel movement to the Protestant Reformations. In fact, they predate Luther. So in fact, they come earlier, if you will. There are several general features. Number one, an attempt at renewal and the reform of monastic orders. And I hasten to add that it was the religious orders that provided so much of the structure for Catholic spirituality in the 16th century. Secondly, the councils. These, including Lateran V that I mentioned earlier, was very important. Thirdly, there was internal papal reform. Not all popes were rascals like Alexander VI and Sixtus IV and Innocent VIII and some of the others who brought more disrepute and shame to the office than anything else. Pius V issued edicts against simony, against blasphemy, against sodomy, against concubinage. He reformed the breviary, the devotional books. He restored Scripture and the reading of Scripture to a dominant place. And fourthly, I would mention the political role. For example, a league of Catholic princes came together and existed for the purposes of defending the Church and destroying Protestantism. And in some areas of Europe, as we will see on another occasion, there was a revival of Catholic political power. I would like to illustrate some of the dimensions of this Catholic Reformation by looking briefly at several people, some of them prominent personalities, all in the period between 1490 and 1540. So it's parallel to the early Reformation itself. But before we do that, let me say that it is necessary to pay particular attention to context. I have said this a number of times in lectures. As a historian, you have to come to terms with the context in order to understand the person, the event, or the idea. And I stress it here again. Catholicism was, and I would argue still is, profoundly local. And it was shaped by nation states, by language, by economy, by folklore, by customs, by that particular context. Certainly doctrine and theology and tradition are important, but so are matters like politics and social issues. To speak of Roman Catholicism, one must speak in concrete local and social context in order to be meaningful. Roman Catholicism is not just about parishes and bishops and popes. In the 16th century, it was mainly lay and rural rather than priestly and urban. So the first person we look at is Johannes Geiler von Keysersberg, another guy with a big name, so let's just call him Geiler. He lived between 1445 and 1510. Catholic preacher and reformer. He was the people's priest in the city of Strasbourg, and this is where his activity is carried out. I'd like to note, in digression here, that Strasbourg became a center of Protestant Reformation activity. Would it be too far off the field to suggest that Geiler prepared the way? It was he, rather than the Protestant reformers, who stressed the importance of the sermon and stressed the validity and the necessity of preaching. In fact, I could also say that in general the 16th century was the golden age of Catholic preaching. Geiler issued a call in Strasbourg for moral reform. People need to give up their gambling, he said, their drinking, their blaspheming, and get serious about God and about their faith. He tried to give concrete substance to his reforms. By contrast, Matteo da Baschio, who founded the Capuchin order in 1526, reduced his preaching to one line: all sinners to hell, all sinners to hell, as he ran through town streets and squares shouting his one-liners. All sinners to hell. Geiler didn't take that reductionistic approach. He tried to put concrete form to the reform, flesh on the bones of the ideas. "O holy bishop," Geiler wrote, "wake up." He's calling on the Pope. "Wake up and reform your church according to the Holy Gospel, according to the apostles, and according to the teachings of the true church." Well, the Synod in Strasbourg did try to make some changes in response to Geiler's call. The cloisters were locked, but the doors were opened if you knocked. Nuns no longer had children, well, at least openly. The clergy gave up wearing their costly clothing. Indeed, the clergy were now quiet in church. That's because they never went, unless they happened to be officiating. Widows and orphans were cared for if they wept blood, and the poor were given clothes to wear, mainly old stockings that other people didn't want. And this is not what the reformer had in mind. This is not what Geiler is getting at all, so he tries again. He attempted to have the Feast of the Fools and the Feast of the Ass abolished in Strasbourg, and he labored here for 32 years, taking special interest in education and moral reform. His program had several emphases, several dominant features. One, he placed stress on the sacraments. He taught that good works have no claim on God's mercy. We're talking about a Catholic preacher. Now, this is something the reformers were saying. Good works have no claim on God's mercy. He stressed divine justice rather than divine mercy. We need to clean up our act. And he taught that sermons prepare the way for the reception of grace through the sacraments. He preached in the vernacular, that is to say in French or German, rather than the Latin. But due to little support from Rome and the rise of the Protestants, his reform efforts were limited, and ultimately of little consequence unless they come into that stream of Protestant thought which would follow him soon after. Our second consideration is Girolamo Savonarola, who lived between 1452 and 1498, and Savonarola's name is very well known, while Guyler's is not so well. In some ways, he was quite similar to Guyler, but in other ways, he diverged quite significantly. He entered the Dominican order at Bologna in 1475, and in 1491, he was made prior of the Dominican convent of San Marco in Florence, and he began preaching in the cathedral, and he gained great fame as a result. Like Guyler von Kaysersberg, he attacked abuses. He claimed, and I quote, "Preachers are more concerned with materialism than spirituality." Here we see Pope Julius II examining the plans for the building of St. Peter's Church in Rome. Savonarola thundered on, "They care more for money than about people." And he insisted Rome has been built for men, for people, not for God. Wealth is an abomination. He's very clear on these points. He called for repentance then on the part of the church and on the part of the city officials. He took up the option for the poor in contrast to this wealthy materialism of his church. And then, as fate would have it, he began seeing visions. And he predicted that by 1494, divine judgment was at hand. Well, that's pretty daring. That gets you attention. But when Charles VIII, the French king, invaded Italy, it seemed that perhaps Savonarola had been correct. And on 2 occasions, Savonarola went out and met with Charles VIII and persuaded him not to sack the city of Florence, and finally the French king withdrew. That's pretty good. He predicts catastrophe, and on 2 occasions he averts it. Savonarola is now the broker of power. Here's a man that can see the future. Here's a man that can avert catastrophe. Pierre de Medici had left the city when the French drew near. Charles was now gone, and thus Savonarola announced that a golden age had dawned. He urged the establishment of a republican government in similar fashion to the one in place in Venice, but a theocratic type of republicanism he wanted, with Jesus as the supreme ruler. I draw your attention to the experiment at Geneva under John Calvin that would be attempted a generation hence. Under this administration, Savonarola put forth his agenda. He wanted a tax reform, aid to the poor. He wanted the courts to be reformed. He also began to engage in censorship. And during the Carnival of 1496, Savonarola held in the city of Florence what was described as the great bonfire of the vanities. A big fire was lit in the town square, and people were encouraged to come and throw their gambling equipment to the flames, their cosmetics, their lewd books, and other items that do not promote spirituality. Let's just have a big public burning of the vanities, preached Pastor Savonarola. Well, it is clear that Girolamo Savonarola is attempting to transform the city of Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, if you will, from a lax, corrupt, pleasure-loving city into an ascetic, monastic-type community. What are we going to do? The Pope, who's Alexander VI, I mentioned him a few moments ago, parties, shenanigans in the Vatican. What are we going to do? Alexander consulted with his colleagues. This guy is causing trouble for us. What do you do with a person like this? You do exactly what the church decided to do in 1496. They offered him a red hat. What's a red hat? That's a cardinal. You buy him off. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton and Winston Churchill and a whole lot of other people had said, let's buy the man off. He wouldn't turn down the red hat now, would he? His response was typical. When he got the invitation to be made cardinal, he wrote, I want no hat, no mitres, that's the big pointy ones, no mitres, great or small. I only want the one that you, O Lord, gave to your saints. Death. A red hat, a hat of blood, that's what I want. Here's a man with a death wish. Here's a man who says the only red hat I want is the hat of the blood of martyrdom in witness of Jesus Christ. He went further. He denounced Pope Alexander VI. I don't have to make any point here to support my comment that Alexander VI and Savonarola were about as antithetical as two human beings can possibly be. The Pope considered Savonarola to be a meddlesome friar, and just as soon as he could pull himself away from one of his wild parties in the papal palace, he excommunicated the said Savonarola. And then Alexander began to use his considerable weight to lean upon Florence and threaten the city with interdict, the suspension of all religious activities within the precincts of the city. Well, Savonarola paid no heed. What did he care what Alexander thought? However, there were a lot of Florentines, citizens of the city, who were afraid that being cut off from the church was being cut off from God, and the consequences were monumental, and some of the elites had had just about enough of this Savonarola guy anyway, burning our books and our gambling and preaching that we shouldn't be enjoying ourselves. His downfall was swift. He was condemned of heresy, he was convicted, and in 1498 burned at the stake in the city of Florence. It was a dramatic end to a dramatic career, but this is where sometimes reform efforts, when they come up against the bureaucratic polity of an institution, collapse. Our third man is British, Reginald Pole, who lived between 1500 and 1558. Now, we've covered this period of church history in a previous lecture, and I mentioned Pole. But now a little more detail on this man that I'm calling a Catholic reformer. He was a cardinal, and he was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1556 until his death in 1558. He had the temerity to write against King Henry VIII and against Henry's act of supremacy. And you wonder, how did he survive? John Fisher lost his head. Thomas More's head was lopped off and put on a sharp stick on London Bridge. How did Pole get away with it? Well, because he wrote his critique from Rome, where he was living, and Great Harry's arm wasn't quite long enough to reach across the channel and grab this troublesome cardinal by the scruff of the neck. Pole was a delegate to the Council of Trent, of which we will hear more of in a few moments. Pole was not adamantly opposed to the Protestants. He said we could talk, maybe there's things that we can learn. I don't think that maybe the teaching on justification by faith is completely wrong. He had previously been appointed by Pope Paul III to a committee for reforming church discipline. And then, when Paul III died, as popes are wont to do, in the year 1549, would you believe that Cardinal Reginald Pole came within a single vote of being elected Pope? I have often wondered how the Church might have responded to the Reformation had Reginald Pole become Pope in 1549, but he lost by a single vote, and Julius III went in, a bona fide loser. And thus, the Church continued on a different trajectory. When Bloody Mary in England burned Thomas Cranmer at the stake in 1556, it was Pole who succeeded him in the see of Canterbury as Archbishop. He did passively, and I underscore the word passively, supported the Marian persecution, and he did work for a reformed reestablishment of Roman Catholicism in England. In terms of Luther's teaching on justification by faith, Pole advised, believe as if salvation depended on faith alone, but act as though it were dependent on works. Shrewd counsel, perhaps. Now, the Fifth Lateran Council, meeting between 1512 and 1517, had put much on paper, and on paper it looked rather impressive. But Leo X, the Pope, proved himself unequal to the task of church renewal. When elected, Leo is reported to have commented, "The papacy is ours. Let us enjoy it." Enjoying the papacy and church reform and renewal did not go together very easily. There is one singular difference between the reforms put forth by Luther and his colleagues and that attempted by the Roman Church. Martin Luther and many other reformers preached a new message in accordance with Scripture, which meant breaking with accepted custom and tradition of the traditional church. Now, officially, Rome wished for renewal in the church, for a restoration of church discipline, if you will, and ideals. And this is summed up very well by Giles of Viterbo, the general of the Augustinian order, when he said, men and women must be changed by religion, not religion by men and women. That's very crucial as a point of departure. People should be changed by religion. Religion should not be changed by people. We want renewal, we want reform, but within specific parameters. Now, the last person I want to draw attention to before I look at some other issues is Ignatius Loyola, 1491 to 1556. He founded a new religious order in 1541 called the Society of Jesus. It is commonly called the Jesuits. It was not, as often supposed, founded in order to combat the Protestants. It was not a contemplative order like the Cistercians, who wanted to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and sing to God and pray and spend the day thinking holy thoughts. No, this was not a contemplative order. This was an active order in the world, and they had a special promise of obedience to the Pope. Here we see Ignatius presenting his rule to Pope Paul III. Jesuits established orphanages, houses for social outcasts, schools. They even started a bank system for peasants. And they engaged in missionary work around the world. The most famous of the Jesuits after Ignatius himself was a man named Francis Xavier. Francis was a student when he ran into Ignatius, as it were, and Loyola challenged Xavier to a game of pool on condition that if Francis lost the match, he would have to undergo the spiritual exercises, which was the title of Ignatius's book. So the two men played the game of pool, and would you have it, Francis lost, and thus began the beginning of his brilliant Jesuit missionary career. He went to India, he went to Japan, he went to China, though he was refused entry in the second place, not third place, China. Ignatius Loyola's book, The Spiritual Exercises, became the handbook of the order. Some of the contents are most significant, and in terms of the Counter-Reformation, I refer to a section titled Rules for Thinking Within the Church. Rules for thinking within the church. I'll share with you 3 of those rules. Number 1, we must put aside all judgment of our own and obey the hierarchical church. Rules for thinking within the church. Number 9, we must praise all of the church's commandments, defend them, and by no means criticize them. Can you see where the mentality is coming? This is taking us across the bridge from reform to counter-reform. And finally, rule number 13. If we wish to proceed securely in all things, we must hold fast to this following principle. What seems to me white, I will believe black, if the church so defines. Well, welcome to the to the Jesuit mentality. You do what you're told, you think what you're taught, don't criticize, don't think, and if I say it's black when it's really white, it's black. Okay? These are rules for thinking within the church according to the Jesuits. Ultimately, the Jesuits did spearhead the intellectual attack upon the Protestants, and they were, in time, the foremost Catholic apologists. Here in the Church of Il Gesù in Rome, observe the altar of the Chapel of St. Ignatius, where religion triumphs over heresy and barbarians come to adore the true faith, the Catholic faith, promoted by the Jesuits. Now we turn our attention at this stage to what might be properly called the Counter-Reformation, and examine briefly some of the salient features and principles which we will on another occasion look at in terms of specific case studies. So my comments now on counter-reform are meant to be general, meant to provide an introduction to a full lecture later on the Counter-Reformation. Counter-Reformation, I think, begins in earnest with the Jesuits and the reign of Pope Paul IV, who sat on the chair of St. Peter from 1555 to 1559. Catholic reform at this stage becomes overshadowed by counter-reformation activity. The general period of this counter-reforming initiative is to be dated principally between 1540 and 1570, though in places like Central and Eastern Europe it will be a bit later, as we will see on another occasion. And again, I repeat, I intend only to introduce the subject here because I will deal with it in some detail later. Think of it this way. The Protestant movement's chances for survival must have appeared fairly slender to Charles V's contemporaries, say in about the year 1520. No doubt Leo X, the Pope who died in 1521, spoke for most of his contemporaries when he dismissed Luther as this troublesome, drunken German monk. But 4 tumultuous decades later, the Reformed gospel could count its converts in the millions. And this fantastic success of the Reformers, and by any human calibration, the success was unbelievable. That within a generation you could go from nobody to millions? This success left a whole generation of Catholics stunned, fearful, and quite prepared, I think, to believe that their time would witness the end not only of Christendom, but of the faith as they knew it, experienced it, and understanding. This was an unbelievable, tumultuous time in religious history in Europe. Think of it this way. There were defections from the church on every level, from the heads of the state of England to the leaders of religious orders, right on down through society, percolating down to the grassroots, common, ordinary level where people by the millions abandoned the official church and followed the Luthers and the Calvins and the Zwinglys and the Cranmers and the Mennos. And these same ordinary people found the poise and the dedication of the Reformers a striking contrast to the ignorance and greed of their parish priests. Well, reform within the Catholic communion could no longer be considered a sufficient deterrent to the advances of these Protestants. A program of reaction was conscientiously implemented. I want to share with you several points of that implementation, which we will see operative in case studies in another lecture. The first is the Council of Trent, which sat for a period of 18 years between 1545 and 1563. This council had been called by Paul III, whom I've mentioned, who was the last of the Renaissance popes. It convened at the northern Italian city of Trent. It had three purposes. It's like some board meetings and committee meetings that I've had to attend. It only had a three-point agenda, but it took them 18 years to deal with that three-point agenda. The first one was to overcome the religious schism, to deal with the Protestants. Okay, fair enough. If I were a Catholic, if I was Paul III, that would be on the front burner. Secondly, was to reform the church. Indeed, another salutary point. And thirdly, to call a united crusade against unbelievers. Would you believe that in 18 years they only got through the first 2 points on the three-point agenda? After 18 years they said, you know, forget this united crusade against the unbelievers. I mean, we're going to be here for another 9 years at this rate. I feel like death is creeping up on me. I've been here 18 years already. Well, they affirmed the equally dual authority of tradition and Scripture over against the evangelical reformers who claimed only the latter. And by the way, the term evangelical was a synonym for Lutherans in Germany in the 16th century. The Tridentine canons, the word Tridentine means coming from Trent, the Latin form, refuted in the end the main teachings of Luther and Calvin and other reformers on matters like authority, the sacraments, on justification, on the definition of the priesthood, and on indulgences. And these 5 issues were the ones that the Protestants had redefined significantly. The goal of the Council of Trent in time, during those 18 years, became less, let's reform the church, to how in the world can we stop these Protestants and save our skin at the same time. Adolf von Harnack, the important and influential German church historian, has commented that the Catholic Church owes to the Protestant Reformation its own self-understanding, its own definition, and indeed its own certainty. The official church, through Trent, reverted to its medieval premises. Trent may then be regarded as both landmark and boundary. And I draw your attention back to one of my opening comments that the 16th century was a period of Catholic formation rather than reformation. I think Harnack is spot on with his comment that Trent defines Catholic Christianity, and it is a revision to its medieval roots. But let us now speak for a moment or two about a man who seems to embody the main thrust at Trent. And that man is the aforementioned Pope Paul IV, who reigned for those 4 years between 1555 and 1559. Having been described, this pope, as possessing an inhuman severity. Some popes, even in our own time, like John the 23rd, the recently deceased John Paul II, have been described as very humane, kind human beings. Not Paul IV, I have to say. Like his predecessor Boniface VIII, Paul was autocratic, holding medieval views of papal authority, papal supremacy, even in political affairs. The world had changed, but he still acted like he was in the 13th century. He denounced the Peace of Augsburg, which recognized officially the Lutheran confessions. He refused to recognize, so full of himself was he, the abdication of Emperor Charles V, who decided to retire. And Paul said, I don't recognize it because he didn't consult with me. He didn't ask me if he should resign as emperor, therefore I do not recognize his abdication. He wouldn't recognize the election of Ferdinand I as Charles' successor on the same grounds. He insisted that Queen Elizabeth I of England submit her claims to the throne to him for adjudication. How dare she become queen when she hasn't asked my opinion? Well, and he had some difficulty with Elizabeth. Well, this, I think, suggests that it's altogether predictable that he would have serious trouble with the Protestants. He wasn't about to parley with them at all. He was violently anti-Protestant. He devoted his energies instead to the Roman Inquisition, and he fired the director of the Inquisition and replaced the director with, guess who? Himself. Yes, it's good to be the director of the Inquisition because the Inquisition has the power to deal with the sorts of people and things you don't like, and who better to define the undesirable than myself? So I shall become Pope and director of the Inquisition. He increased the power and the jurisdiction of the inquisitorial machinery. He promulgated the Index, of which we will hear of in a moment, and he promoted other repressive measures against Protestants and other undesirables. He became, I have to tell you, by the end of his papal reign, highly, highly unpopular. When he died, oh, there were no accolades. There was not a lot of mourning, weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth and lamentation and all that sort of thing. No. In Rome, mobs gathered and rioted. They stormed the headquarters of the Inquisition. They released all of the prisoners out of the inquisitorial jails. They toppled Paul's statue from the Capitol and mutilated it. And I hope I'm right in saying, I read somewhere recently that Paul's head, the statue's head, was not too long ago fished out of the Tiber River in Rome. This was a guy that people just didn't like, and they wanted to be rid not only of him, but anything that reminded them. So the statue's down, the head's lopped off into the Tiber, and let's just attack the Inquisition while we're at it. Another way in which the Roman Church attempted to stem the tide of the Protestant current was through its previously established Holy Office, which is known as the Inquisition. And of course, Paul, as I just mentioned, had attempted to utilize that. The Roman Inquisition was modeled on the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition had been established in the year 1480 or thereabouts. The Roman Inquisition operated in Italy just as it did in Spain, although there were some modifications. For example, the city of Venice refused to allow the Roman Inquisition to operate within its sphere of authority unless the Roman Inquisition was prepared to be strictly monitored by Venetian authorities. Most of the fury of the Roman Inquisition in the end came to be directed against heretics like the Waldensians, whom we have encountered previously. Another tool to limit the influence of the Reformers was through the implementation of a device that Paul IV had begun called the Index. To get at the root of the problem of heresy, or indeed at the root of the problem of religious dissent, like Reformation, the official church began an attack upon literary works. The index. What is the index? It's a published list of prohibited books that are determined either to be unfit to own or to read. As early as the year 1515, the Fifth Lateran Council, declared that no book was to be printed without prior examination and consent by the church. This is the roots of the index. We're going to approve books that are published and disseminated, and if it doesn't meet with our criteria, then to the bonfire. Now that's the theory at Lateran 5. Paul will make it an official policy of the church. Now the first list of banned books appeared in the year 1559, and the categories included the following. 1. Any book that had been condemned prior to 1515 was on the list. Okay, so it's kind of a retroactive rule-making device. Secondly, books written by heretics, and I add on any subject. You could be, say, a heretical theologian who's written, say, a travel guide. Nope, because you're a heretic, anything that you write is out to the fire, and that's it. Thirdly, third category of prohibited materials, translations of religious books written by heretics or condemned authors. So not only the book in its original language, but books in translation. Fourth, all Bibles that have been written in the common language, translated rather, into the common language. They're out. If the Latin Vulgate was good enough for Paul the Apostle, it's good enough for me. Now, I'm being facetious, of course, but it was the Latin Vulgate that was the text. We don't need the common language. Fifth, books in the vernacular, dealing with controversies between the church and heretics. And we don't need to be educating people about those particular issues and controversies. And another category were immoral books. But of course, who's going to decide what's moral and what's immoral? Why, the Inquisition will, of course. The first index also listed some 60 publishers. That meant that any book published by any one of these presses, regardless of its author, its subject, or its content, was declared banned. These were drastic measures, condemned by many, including Catholic humanists. But to this very day, Catholic books contain the explicit nihil obstat and the imprimatur as indications that books are okay for the faithful to read. The Latin term nihil obstat simply means nothing conflicts, and the word imprimatur means it may be published. If you're a Catholic author publishing a book with a Catholic publisher, you will have to have that book reviewed prior to publication and receive the nihil obstat and the imprimatur. That means that while the church is not necessarily endorsing the work, it sees nothing that conflicts with its positions, and therefore it may be published for consideration. All right now, conclusions. The Catholic and the Counter-Reformations, and these are two separate entities. I suggest both of them, Catholic Reform and Counter-Reformation, had some success. The vertical lines through the brown-colored areas on this map to the right indicate those areas wherein Catholicism recovered their losses from the Protestants. I think you can see that the recovery was fairly substantial. In the next lecture, we'll be going to those areas and having a look at what exactly happened in the swing from Protestant to Catholic, but that on another occasion. But none of these measures that I have been speaking of, Inquisition, Index, the Tridentine decrees, none of them had lasting success in countering the Protestant Reformation. It was as simple as this: the times had changed. No longer would kings be forced to stand, as they did here at Canossa, in the snow, barefoot, and yield to the will of a pope in Rome. No longer could dissent be effectively punished and contained across Europe. For the Renaissance and the Reformation had changed the way power and authority were understood, the way in which it was administered. And at least a segment of the population, I would argue, were thinking in quite different ways from the medieval mentalities. The revolution of ideas had in fact revolutionized the human mind, and its implications were capable of further revolutionizing Western culture and Western society and Western Christianity irrevocably. Well, that of course did not happen all at once. The Catholic Reformation, I would argue, was an important aspect of that growth towards modernity. Indeed, while the Counter-Reformation, of which we shall hear more of on another occasion, was, in my estimation, the last gasp of an outdated approach to religion. A gasp that was, in fact, heard round Europe. A gasp which only hastened the implications of an evolving Christian faith, now more than ever established upon the rock.